Hello again, APUSH Nation. It's Mr. Majewski. We're going to be finishing up the slavery slides right now. We're going to try to do it really quickly, and it's going to be easy to do because the second half of these slides go very, very quickly. We're starting on slide 64, alrighty, abolition. This corresponds to Roman numeral 6 in the slavery notes, page 8. Alrighty, I'll give you a moment to get caught up. Alright, let's begin. Again, the abolitionist movement, the movement to abolish slavery in the United States, begins in the North, of course. Actually, when it began, it was considered to be very unpopular, both in the North and South. Originally, abolitionists were kind of viewed as troublemakers, rabble-rousers, people who were causing problems, causing social conflict when it didn't need to exist. Over time, support for abolition is going to increase in the North. As support for abolition goes up in the North, resistance to abolition increases in the South. Okay, so let's begin now. We're going to move to slide 66. We're going to take a look at a map here of where slavery existed and where it was abolished in 1800. As you can see, in 1800, really New England down to Pennsylvania were the only areas that had completely abolished slavery. Of course, the old areas of the Northwest Territory were going to be free as well. Of course, the South was all still very much a slave dominant place. Then you look again at the next slide, slide 67. You take a look at the legal status of slavery in 1861. As you can see, again, really, the map looks like what the map's going to look like in the Civil War. Alrighty, you're going to see most of the blue states remain loyal to the North, and the red states are, for the most part, going to switch to join the Confederacy. They're going to secede away from the North. Alrighty. So where does abolition begin? Well, to be honest with you, our very first abolition group was the American Colonization Society. Now, they're founded way back in 1817. We don't associate them with a particular person, already. It's just our first group. They were looking for realistic, practical solutions to the slavery issue. And they supported something called recolonization, alrighty? What they believed, these were Northerners and Southerners, they wanted to free African-American slaves and then send them back to Africa, alrighty? They came up with a plan to create a new country in Africa called Liberia, based on the concept of liberty for slaves. If you look at Liberia's around today, if you look at it in Africa, their flag today looks almost exactly the same as the United States, because this country was literally created by abolitionists who were looking for an early solution to the slave problem. Again, you need to understand, even in their efforts to remove slaves, in a way it's kind of racist, right? Because their attitude is, oh, blacks and whites can't live alongside each other now that blacks are free. Okay, anyways, this is technically our first group. They promoted colonization, recolonization of Africans back to Africa. Alrighty, this was actually a group that was supported by Abraham Lincoln early in his political career. Alrighty. We're going to move on to number 69. Again, Liberia, the country, founded on the West African coast. And again, 15,000 freed blacks were sent to Liberia. They colonized it, settled it originally. Most American blacks didn't want to go. Most slaves didn't want to go. Alrighty, even after they were freed, their attitude was, I'm an American. I want to stay in the United States. Alrighty. Anyways, again, that was the first big movement. Now, abolition really takes off. It really grows during the reform movements, inspired by the Second Great Awakening. Abolition in the United States got a big boost from the ending of slavery in England, in Britain. All right, Britain's going to abolish slavery. Eventually, France is going to abolish slavery as well. Mexico, remember, abolishes slavery very early. So the United States abolitionist movement gets a big boost every time another one of these countries freed their slaves, which put more and more pressure on the United States to do that as well. Alrighty. Now, we consider the beginning of what we call the radical abolition movement. Those radical abolitionists are those who wanted complete, immediate emancipation. They wanted complete end to slavery right away. They're not going to wait. None of this free territory stuff where they're going to keep it in some places but not allow it to extend. Radical abolitionists wanted slavery ended immediately. And it all begins with this man on slide 71. His name is William Lloyd Garrison. He's considered to be really kind of the trailblazer, the spark. He's a Boston abolitionist. He writes a very influential, famous pamphlet newspaper. It's called The Liberator. Alrighty. Again, it's considered the beginning of the radical abolitionist movement. His first issue, he basically comes out and he says, hey, I will not back down. I'm not going to stop until we have completely abolished slavery. We've ended it in this country. Again, he compares kind of the North and the South. The North is good, the South is evil, kind of according to Garrison, because they've allowed this institution of slavery to continue. He says there's no practical solution. Recolonization won't work. The only solution is absolute abolition. Alrighty. He inspires the formation of our first major radical abolitionist group. It's called the American Anti-Slavery Society. He was one of its leading members after he begins publishing The Liberator. Again, his most famous quote here on page 73, "I am in earnest, I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." He's basically saying, I'm not going to back down. I'm not going to quiet down until slavery is ended in this country. All right, slide 75. Again, Garrison's efforts lead to the development of the American Anti-Slavery Society, alrighty, the AASS. Was founded by these radical abolitionists, including Garrison. They wanted to have more political influence. They wanted to maybe be able to elect abolitionist politicians, and so their first setup was to create this group, this society, that would become more politically involved. Some important members. Theodore Dwight Weld, alright, he is a kind of a preacher. He's an evangelical. He's inspired by the Second Great Awakening. He was specifically inspired by Charles Grandison Finney. And he writes a story called American Slavery as It Is, where he kind of exposes for one of the first times how slaves are going to be treated in the South throughout the United States. Alrighty, let's move on here to slide 76. Alrighty. And that takes us to Wendell Phillips. Wendell Phillips is considered the great speaker, the great orator of the abolition movement. He was called Abolition's golden trumpet because he had this amazing voice, his amazing speaking voice. He could really rile people up. Again, he was pretty wealthy, and he devoted kind of his life to this issue. He actually married one of the Grimke sisters, if you remember them from the women's rights movement. Again, he's considered by many to maybe be the most important of the abolitionists. He had a huge impact with his speeches on convincing politicians to support abolition. Again, one of our great speakers, another product of the Second Great Awakening. He too inspired by those reforms. Alrighty. Anyways, yeah, very strong influence. Very strong influence that Wendell Phillips had on other politicians. He's really important. Let's remember Wendell Phillips. Alrighty, the Golden Trumpets. Angelina and Sarah Grimke, let's remember them. They, of course, are white Southern women. They become leading abolitionists. They're also involved in the women's rights movement, as you remember. Angelina, of course, was married to Theodore Weld. Alrighty. A new member you need to be aware of, Lydia Maria Childe. She's one of our famous white abolitionist females. She writes a book calling for the immediate emancipation of slaves. She was technically the first white female to write a book about this. And she also called for equal membership of women in the American Anti-Slave Society. Look, you need to understand there were a couple of others who technically weren't abolitionists, but they funded the entire movement. They were super wealthy merchants named Arthur and Lewis Tappan. They supplied the money that basically funded all of these abolitionists as they traveled around the country, changing people's minds. They funded the Liberator, for instance. They funded the Anti-Slavery Society. It was their money that kept this movement going. Again, over time, what's going to happen is the organization, the American Anti-Slave Society, is going to split. It's going to split along gender issues. What's going to happen is women more and more are going to form their own women's rights groups. They're going to kind of be excluded from the American Anti-Slavery Society because the abolitionists want to focus on ending slavery, whereas the women want to do both things at the same time. Alrighty. Garrison felt like that would split the message, therefore there's going to be a split along gender lines. Alright, now hey, there's some real famous black abolitionists as well that you need to know. David Walker is one of our first extreme black abolitionists. He actually called for violence, any means necessary to end slavery. Sojourner Truth, very famous, an old, in her 80s, freed black woman. She was very, very much in favor of women's rights. She was an early women's rights leader and obviously one of the earliest abolitionists. She put a real face, almost like a grandmotherly face, and a perspective on this movement. She gave a very famous speech. It was called Ain't I a Woman, where she talked about, her life and dealing with being, stuck in this situation. Alrighty. Elijah Lovejoy, he's white. He's not an African American. He's a white newspaper editor, guys. He is in Illinois, and he's killed actually by a pro-slavery mob. He was printing these anti-slavery publications. The mob got angry at him. They ended up killing him. He becomes a martyr. He becomes one of the heroes of the movement. Other abolitionists really used his name to rile up support and to gain support for abolition throughout the entire North. Anyways, remember him only because of his death. Alrighty. A few others. Martin Delaney, somebody that we don't really usually cover very well, but hey, it's another name that is sometimes thrown out there. Now, this is somebody you do need to know on slide 84. It's Frederick Douglass. He's the greatest of the black abolitionists. Alrighty. He published his own abolitionist newspaper. He was a slave. He had escaped slavery. He wrote a famous autobiography, and was ultimately able to become a leader. He was self-taught. Alrighty. What I mean there is he had no formal education. Alrighty. Again, his narrative, his autobiography, very, very famous. He's considered to be maybe the greatest, one of the greatest abolitionists, and by far the greatest African-American abolitionist. An incredible speaker, very knowledgeable, very thoughtful, very intelligent. He looked to politics to end slavery. He basically said, hey, we need to change it politically. We need to vote it out. That's the only way to get rid of it. Alrighty. Anyways, he was also willing to compromise. He was willing to compromise if it meant, some slaves would be freed over time. Alrighty, so he's much more practical than many of these other extreme abolitionists. Alrighty. Eventually, most abolitionists, no matter where they started, no matter whether they were a colonist member or not, whether they supported recolonization or whether they supported extreme abolition, over time, abolitionists come to be convinced the only solution was war. Alrighty, that was the only way that ultimately slavery was going to be gotten rid of. Now, one of the most famous successes of the abolition movement was the Underground Railroad. What the Underground Railroad was a network of homes, of businesses, of buildings that were spread throughout the United States, throughout the southern states, and also into the north. And it was a secret underground organization that helped to rescue slaves and then to provide them a secret path towards freedom. You got to understand, when slaves escaped, they were chased by slave hunters, by masters, by dogs, by things like that. And so what would happen is the abolitionists set up this network that would help guide or lead slaves to safety up in the north. Alrighty. Anyways, again, many times these slaves would be escorted all the way up to Canada if need be, and again they were aided by white and black abolitionists who helped them along the way. They called it a railroad, all right, because you went from one house to the next as you made your route up north, one stop to the next, almost like one train station to the next. Usually they traveled at night, they traveled in secrecy, they traveled in hiding, because of course they were being chased, they didn't want to be apprehended. The most famous of the conductors, the most famous of these abolitionists who led these folks to freedom, was a lady named Harriet Tubman. She freed over 300 slaves. She's considered the Moses of her people for leading so many of them to freedom. She's one of many. You need to understand that. Slide 89 shows you the various routes of the Underground Railroad. Again, this was an extensive network. It was set up all throughout the United States by these abolitionists. There were routes north. There were even routes south into Mexico as well, because again they had abolished slavery. Already, the only true freedom that a slave had was to get to Canada or Mexico at this time, because conceivably, even if they made it up to the north to a free state, if they were apprehended by their master, they'd be brought back. That's what the Fugitive Slave Law said. Alrighty, now, when Southerners came up to get some of these escaped slaves, some of these rescued slaves, the state court of Pennsylvania ruled in a case called Prigg versus Pennsylvania that they couldn't take their slaves back. Eventually, the Supreme Court stepped in and said, wrong, 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 state court of Pennsylvania. We have a fugitive slave law. Federal law outweighs state law. So therefore, slave owners are allowed to come back up and to get their slaves if they can find them, even if they make it up into the north. That's why so many, again, ended up in Canada to guarantee they would be free in the future. Many northern states, like Pennsylvania, passed what were called personal liberty laws, which tried to protect slaves or It would protect slaves. It would sometimes prohibit officials in those states from helping Southerners try to find their slaves as well. It made it illegal for them to do anything to help the Southerner get their slave and bring them back to the South. Alrighty, anyways, by 1850, Southerners, when they find out about this Underground Railroad, when they realize how extensive it is, they blame abolitionists, and they wanted a stronger fugitive slave law. That's going to be one of the biggest things they're going to fight for. They consider the old one, dating all the way back to the 1790s, to be too weak. Now you need to understand, there aren't a ton of slaves that escape, about 1,000 every single year. Alrighty. In fact, many more slaves were able to buy their freedom or were released by their owner on their own rather than escaped. Alright. Again, every time a slave does escape, though, it just is another reason why Southerners grew to despise the abolitionists and grew to despise the North. Okay. Let's move to slide 94. Alrighty, Southerners' response to abolition, because this is really fascinating to me. Okay, well, we know this is going to be pretty quick, because some of these responses actually go back to stuff we've already covered. Alrighty, in the 1820s, actually, there were more Southern anti-slavery societies than Northern. So what changed? Well, in the 1830s, those abolitionists really disappeared from the South. Alrighty. Nat Turner's revolt, the slave revolt, the arrival of the Liberator by Garrison, the rise of the abolition movement, convinced a majority of Southerners that the North was becoming more united. The North was going to take away their slaves. And ultimately, more and more Southerners became defensive and protective of slavery. Think about John C. Calhoun. He's a great example of that. Remember, the nullification crisis that takes place in the 1830s was really about slavery, right? Remember, the Southerners felt if we lose this, eventually we are going to eventually lose slavery as well. All right, so we can't set the precedent of losing to the federal government this time around. Abolitionist literature was banned in many southern states. When it went into the mail system, it was removed. Alrighty. Technically, this is going to be illegal. Alrighty, it's technically unconstitutional, but southern states did it anyways. Alrighty, they did this because southern plantation owners were angry when abolitionists would send literature through the southern mail system. Alrighty, slide 98. One of the most famous examples of reaction is that Southerners began writing their own books defending slavery, glorifying slavery, making it sound like it was a happy relationship, almost like a father-child relationship. The most famous of what we call these apologists, these guys who tried to rewrite history and make slavery seem enjoyable, beneficial, was a guy named George Fitzhugh. He was a Southerner. He basically said, hey, slaves are happy. They breathe fresh air. They live out in the open. They work for happy owners. They live a happy lifestyle. He basically tried to make it seem like Northerners who were working in factories were the real slaves. All right, he talked about how, hey, blacks always work. We have full employment. We have no such thing as unemployment. Of course, this is ridiculous, right? Because they had employment because they didn't pay these people. They didn't give them any rights. They didn't give them fair treatment. All righty. Anyways, these are some of the arguments that were made by Fitzhugh and other Southern apologists. Alrighty, and they became very popular. They became very well read. Anytime an abolitionist wrote a book, there would be dozens of Southern books in response. Alright, a couple of other things here. Other Northern attempts, I should say Southern attempts, to try to resist abolition. In 1836, Southerners passed something called the gag resolution in Congress. The gag is like something that a robber puts in somebody's mouth so they won't scream. Anyways, what it said was anytime abolition or anti-slavery was mentioned in Congress, immediately all negotiation, all discussion stopped, and Congress closed, shut down. Alrighty? This was done by a majority of Southerners who didn't want to have any chance for abolition bills or laws to become passed. And so literally, if abolition was mentioned in Congress, then Congress shut down. That session shut down. That was called the gag resolution. Northerners despised it. John Quincy Adams came out of retirement and came back into Congress specifically to beat this gag resolution. He fought an 8-year fight. He was successful in getting it repealed. Alrighty. Now, despite that, they were never able to really stop Southerners from banning abolitionist material in the mail. Alrighty, now abolitionists in the North were actually viewed as unpopular as well a lot of this time, especially early on. They were viewed kind of again as troublemakers, like they might lead to a civil war. Alrighty, this was especially the case since early on, let's remember, the North was dependent on Southern cotton more and more in the 1800s. there were actually some mob outbursts in the North against abolitionists, like Elijah Lovejoy. So again, sometimes they were viewed as radicals, they were viewed as just too extreme. However, by 1850, abolitionists changed the mind of the North. They're much more sympathetic to ending slavery than ever